She has been in the interview room for 45 minutes. No phone, no familiar voices, no distractions. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights above and the hollow echo of her own thoughts. The chair beneath her shifts slightly every time she moves, its metal legs scraping against the tile in a way that makes the silence even louder. Detectives haven't entered yet. They're not in a rush. In fact, this is part of the plan. The longer she sits alone, the more the room begins to work against her. Walls that once felt neutral now feel like they're leaning in. The table, heavy and cold, becomes a barrier instead of a surface. Sarah thinks she's here to clear up a simple misunderstanding. In her mind, she'll be walking out soon, back to her life, back to normal. But what she doesn't know is that the people on the other side of the door aren't wondering if she is guilty. They were certain. And every minute that passes without her realizing, it is another minute they regaining the upper hand. This is where the real interrogation begins, not with shouted accusations or dramatic evidence drops, but with quiet pressure, calculated silence, and an understanding of human behavior that can unravel the strongest story a suspect can tell. The case began on an ordinary weekday in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where front lawns stay trimmed, where neighbors know each other by name, and where serious crime is supposed to be something that happens somewhere else. But on that morning, a single phone call to 911 changed everything. The caller reported a missing person, Lisa, a 34-year-old woman who hadn't shown up for work. She was known for being punctual to the point of obsession. The report wasn't brushed aside. Friends and family insisted that something was wrong. By the afternoon, her car had been found abandoned in a strip mall parking lot just 2 miles from her home. Inside, her purse, keys, and phone were all still there. Detectives quickly learned that the last person known to have seen her was Sarah. According to Sarah's statement, she and Lisa had met for coffee 2 days earlier. Sarah claimed she had no idea where Lisa might be now and expressed concern for her friend. On paper, it sounded cooperative. But something about her delivery bothered investigators. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way she spoke them, the way her eyes seemed to avoid direct contact at certain moments. Over the next 48 hours, detectives pieced together fragments of surveillance footage, credit card records, and witness statements. A timeline began to take shape, and Sarah's version of events started to develop small cracks. Still, without concrete evidence, the detectives needed more than suspicion. They needed a moment where Sarah's own behavior would tell them what she wasn't saying. That's why she was invited, politely, not under arrest, to come down to the station to help fill in a few gaps. Sarah agreed. She walked into the building believing she could explain herself, confident that she could keep her story straight. She didn't know that the interview room was designed for more than just conversation. Every chair placement, every sound, even the temperature of the room was chosen to create pressure, not enough to make her bolt, but enough to make her mind start looking for an exit. By the time the door clicked shut, the detectives already knew this was where the case would turn. They had her words, they had her timeline, and soon they'd have the one thing that would matter most, her unguarded reactions. When the door finally opened, Sarah looked up with a small smile. It was polite, almost overly so, as if she was trying to set the tone for what she thought would be a friendly conversation. The lead detective, a man in his mid-40s with a calm but watchful demeanor, greeted her by first name. His partner stayed silent, taking a seat across from her without a word. This is a subtle tactic. One officer engages, the other observes. It allows the second detective to watch her reactions without being part of the verbal exchange, giving them a cleaner read on her body language. The first few minutes were small talk, work, the weather, how she'd been sleeping. Sarah answered without hesitation. Her tone was light, her posture relaxed. But this stage isn't about the answers, it's about establishing a baseline. Detectives need to know what normal looks like for her so they can spot the shifts later. At the 6-minute mark, the conversation turned to Lisa. Sarah leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the table. She described their coffee meeting in detail, where they sat, what they ordered, even a brief anecdote about the barista. On the surface, this looked like cooperation, but her recounting contained what interrogators call unnecessary specificity, adding excessive, irrelevant details to create the impression of honesty. When asked what they discussed that day, Sarah hesitated for the first time. It was a subtle pause, barely a second, but enough for both detectives to notice. She quickly filled the gap by saying they talked about work and just life stuff. The vague wording stood out against the overly specific coffee details. This contrast suggested she was more comfortable describing the setting than the content of their conversation. At 10 minutes, the silent detective asked his first question. Did Lisa seem worried about anything? Sarah's head tilted slightly to one side, a classic delay tactic gesture that buys time while she formulates a safe response. She shook her head slowly, saying no. But as she did, her lips pressed together in a way that suggested suppressed tension. By the 15-minute mark, the question shifted from open-ended to more pointed. What time did you last see her? And did you drive anywhere together after coffee? Sarah's answers remained calm, but her hand movements changed. She began touching her face, brushing hair back, scratching her cheek. While these gestures aren't proof of deception, a sudden increase in self-touching can signal discomfort. Detectives then introduced a known truth question, something they could verify independently. Did you stop at the grocery store that day? Sarah said no. Surveillance footage already showed her car in the store's parking lot. This wasn't a trap meant to expose her immediately. It was a seed. By confirming she would lie about something minor, the detectives learned she was willing to lie about bigger things. Around the 25-minute mark, the lead detective shifted to a more empathetic tone. He leaned forward, softened his voice, and said, "Look, sometimes things happen that we can't control. Sometimes people just snap. This is a minimization technique, offering a suspect an explanation that makes their actions seem more understandable, lowering the barrier to confession." Sarah's eyes dropped to the table. She didn't nod or respond, but the lack of denial was telling. At 33 minutes, the first direct confrontation arrived. "We know you were with Lisa the day she disappeared." Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a small, tight expression that didn't reach her eyes. Smiling in a high-stress moment can be a defense mechanism, an attempt to mask fear with composure. But here, it read as incongruent with the gravity of the accusation. The detectives let silence stretch. In interrogation psychology, silence is often more powerful than questions. Most people feel compelled to fill the gap, and Sarah did just that, launching into a long explanation about how she barely even saw Lisa and had no reason to hurt her. The problem? No one had suggested harm at that point. The premature defense hinted that the idea was already on her mind. At the 40-minute mark, the partner detective slid a folder onto the table. He didn't open it. He didn't say what was inside. Just the presence of the folder was enough to change Sarah's breathing. She glanced at it 3 times in the next 20 seconds, each time quicker than before. This was a visual pressure cue, a silent reminder that the investigation had weight behind it. From here, her answers began to shorten. She crossed her arms for the first time, her shoulders drawing in. The baseline calm from earlier was gone. The lead detective pressed gently. "If something happened, now's the time to tell us your side. Waiting only makes it worse." She shook her head but didn't speak for nearly 8 seconds, a silence long enough to register as significant. By the 55-minute mark, the folder was opened. Inside were still images from surveillance cameras placing Sarah's car near Lisa's abandoned vehicle just hours before it was found. This was the break point. She shifted in her seat, her breathing shallow, her gaze fixed on the table. When asked if she could explain it, she muttered, I don't know." For detectives, this was the first crack, a move from confident denial to uncertainty. and once that crack appears, the interrogation changes direction entirely. Sarah's behavior in the interview room wasn't just a series of random reactions. It followed predictable psychological patterns that emerge when a person under investigation feels control slipping away. From the moment she entered, Sarah projected confidence. She walked in without hesitation, greeted the detectives with a smile, and adopted a relaxed posture. This initial composure can be a self-preservation strategy. In interrogation psychology, it's sometimes called impression management. The suspect consciously tries to present themselves as cooperative and harmless. The goal is to set the tone before the questioning even begins, but maintaining this front is exhausting. As the interview progressed, subtle indicators of strain began to surface. The micro pauses before certain answers, the increase in self-touching, the defensive body positioning. None of these alone prove deception, but in context, and especially when they align with known pressure points in the questioning, they become part of a behavioral pattern. One of the clearest markers came during the known truth question about the grocery store. Lying about something verifiable is a sign of what's known as deceptive commitment. It shows that the suspect is willing to risk exposure even over a detail that seems small. Psychologically, this indicates the person is treating the conversation as a battlefield where conceding any ground, even on the minor points, feels dangerous. Her smile during direct confrontation is another key insight. Under stress, some individuals respond with masking behaviors, actions that attempt to conceal inner turmoil. Smiling can be used to project calm, but when it's mismatched to the emotional tone of the situation, it becomes a red flag. It's not the smile itself that's suspicious, it's the mismatch between expression and context. The most telling shift happened when the folder of evidence was placed on the table. Even before it was opened, Sarah's focus repeatedly returned to it. This shows anticipatory anxiety, her mind jumping ahead to possible contents and outcomes. Psychologists often note that when a suspect fixates visually on a stimulus, it's because they perceive it as a threat to their control of the situation. When the images were revealed, Sarah's verbal responses contracted sharply. Long explanations became short denials. Her breathing pattern shifted. Slower inhalations, shallow exhalations, suggesting she was consciously trying to regulate her physical state, a form of self-soothing under stress. Her final pivot from denial to uncertainty, I don't know, marks a psychological break. At this stage, the suspect often experiences cognitive overload, the combination of mental fatigue, emotional stress, and the realization that their narrative is unsustainable. It's in this space that many interrogations either reach confession or elicit statements that can be dismantled later with evidence. What's notable about Sarah is that she never outright confessed in that moment. Instead, she entered a psychological holding pattern, speaking less, withdrawing physically, avoiding eye contact. For detectives, this isn't failure, it's progress. A suspect in this state is more likely to reconsider their stance in subsequent sessions or when confronted in court. Sarah's interview is a clear example of how interrogations are less about the words exchanged and more about the gradual erosion of a person's defensive structure. Each tactic, from silence to minimization to the strategic reveal of evidence, was aimed at destabilizing her perception of control. And while Sarah walked out of that room without a confession, the psychological groundwork had been laid for the case to move forward. The detective's approach to Sarah's interview wasn't improvised. It followed a deliberate framework designed to expose inconsistencies, increase psychological pressure, and make silence feel heavier than speech. The first key move was baseline establishment. By starting with neutral, easy questions, they created a behavioral reference point. They learned what Sarah's voice sounded like when she was relaxed, how she gestured when speaking comfortably, and how she held herself physically when the topic was harmless. This baseline would later serve as the control against which all stress-induced deviations could be measured. Next came incremental pressure building. The detectives didn't jump straight to accusations. They transitioned gradually from safe topics to ones closer to the core of the case. This progression serves two purposes. It avoids triggering immediate defensiveness, and it allows the suspect to commit to statements that can later be challenged. The introduction of the known truth question about the grocery store was a textbook credibility test. By asking something they already had evidence for, the detectives could observe Sarah's willingness to lie about small, verifiable details. A truthful answer would have added credibility to her earlier statements. A false one, as they got, weakened her entire narrative. They then employed minimization, framing the possibility of wrongdoing in a way that made it seem more understandable or excusable. This technique can reduce a suspect's internal resistance to admitting involvement, as it subtly shifts the conversation from "did you do it?" to "why did you do it?" Silence was another critical tool. After presenting a pointed statement or an uncomfortable truth, the detectives resisted the urge to fill the air. Long pauses created an environment where Sarah felt compelled to speak, often revealing more than she intended. The prop placement of the evidence folder was a strategic, nonverbal tactic. Before revealing its contents, they allowed its presence to work on Sarah's imagination. Anticipation can be more unsettling than the actual evidence, and in this case, her repeated glances at the folder showed it was having the desired effect. Finally, the selective reveal, showing the surveillance stills, was timed for maximum impact. It came after nearly an hour of conversation, when Sarah's mental energy was already depleted. In this state, suspects are more likely to make mistakes in their responses or display physical tells that they could otherwise suppress. By the end of the session, Sarah hadn't confessed, but the strategy had achieved its objective. She had shifted from confident denials to uncertain, hesitant answers. That shift, subtle as it may seem, was the opening investigators needed to tighten their case outside the interview room. When Sarah left the interrogation room, she still wasn't under arrest. She walked out into the cool night air, carrying the belief that she had held her ground. But what she didn't know was that the session had been less about extracting an immediate confession and more about gathering ammunition for the next phase of the investigation. Inside the observation room, detectives replayed key portions of the recording. They marked the hesitation before she answered certain questions, the moments where her body language shifted, and her repeated avoidance of direct eye contact during specific topics. These details, while subtle, would be powerful in court, not as standalone proof, but as context that undermined her credibility. The grocery store lie was a turning point. Investigators already had time-stamped footage showing her car in the parking lot, and now they had her on record denying it. In legal terms, this inconsistency might seem minor, but in the eyes of a jury, it could plant seeds of doubt about everything else she claimed. The surveillance stills linking her car to the area where Lisa S.'s vehicle was abandoned gave the case new momentum. That photographic evidence, combined with cell phone tower data placing her nearby, built a strong circumstantial web. Even without a confession, the prosecution could argue opportunity, motive, and deception under questioning. In the weeks following the interview, forensic analysis of Lisa S.'s car uncovered trace fibers consistent with the interior of Sarah S.'s vehicle. While not definitive proof of direct contact, it added another layer to the case. The investigative team also located a witness who recalled seeing two women matching Sarah and Lisa A.'s descriptions near the strip mall on the day of the disappearance. When the case reached court, the defense tried to portray Sarah as cooperative, emphasizing that she voluntarily came in for questioning. But the jury also saw the same footage the detectives had reviewed: pauses, contradictions, and nervous gestures that clashed with the image of someone with nothing to hide. In the end, Sarah was convicted on a combination of circumstantial evidence, forensic links, and the inferences drawn from her own behavior in that room. The interrogation hadn't produced a direct admission of guilt, but it had created a roadmap for the investigation to follow, one that ultimately led to a verdict. For the detectives, It was a reminder that sometimes the real breakthrough isn't a dramatic confession. It's the quiet shift from certainty to hesitation. The moment when a suspect realizes the narrative they've built is no longer holding together. That's when the case truly starts to turn. You've just seen how a simple conversation can unravel into something far more revealing. But here's the question. Did you catch the exact moment Sarah's confidence started to crack? Was it the grocery store lie, the folder on the table, or the silence that stretched too long? I want to hear your take. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me what you think was her breaking point. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. Every story we cover gives you another piece of the puzzle for understanding human behavior under pressure. Your observations might be sharper than you think. Let's put them to the test. Interrogations aren't battles of strength, they're battles of patience. Every pause, every question, every shift in tone is part of a deliberate design. For Sarah, the interview began as a formality, something she believed she could navigate with ease. But over the course of less than an hour, her posture changed. Her answers shortened, and the certainty in her voice began to fade. Whether a suspect talks for 10 minutes or 10 hours, the process is rarely about getting someone to slip up in a single dramatic moment. It's about creating an environment where the truth becomes harder to hide than the lie. And sometimes, the most telling evidence is the change in a person's behavior when they realize the people across the table aren't buying their story. For detectives, Sarah's case was proof that silence, subtlety, and observation can be more powerful than confrontation. For the rest of us, it is a reminder that human behavior, no matter how practiced, can always mask the truth under sustained pressure. If you've been following this breakdown, you've seen how the smallest details, a pause, a glance, a mismatched expression, can shift the course of an entire investigation. And while the outcome in this case was built on many pieces, the interview room was where the foundation was set. In the end, Sarah walked in believing she was in control. She walked out without realizing she had already lost it.